It's time for the Longines Chronoscope, a television journal of the important issues of the hour. A presentation of the Longines Whitnor Watch Company, maker of Longines, the world's most honored watch, and Whitnor, distinguished companion to the world-honored Longines. Good evening. This is Frank Knight. May I introduce our co-editors for this evening? Mr. Hardy Burt, author and correspondent, and Mr. William H. Kearns, Jr., military editor of Business Week magazine. Our distinguished guest for this evening is General Lewis B. Hershey, Director of Selective Service.
General Hershey, what you say and what you do these days, sir, is very important to quite a lot of people, to say the least. Now, with President Eisenhower's recent action on Formosa, there are quite a few authorities who believe that there will be a quickening of action in Formosa, a more aggressive policy. I know that you can't give away any plans to the enemy, but could you answer this question? Will there be any stepping up of draft requirements in the forthcoming year? Will more men be needed?
Well, yes, there are going to be more men needed. However, we knew it long before General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, has stepped up the present situation because men went in soon after Korea started. Those men are now coming out and they have to be replaced, and that's going to take more people than we put in last year. So the answer is yes, but the reason I either don't know or think is no.
Well, the communists aren't going to learn anything from you on Chronoscope, I can see that. Now, there'll be 53,000, I understand, inducted in February. Is that right, sir?
That's right. Yeah.
Now, is this very much higher than the usual average for inductees?
Well, it's 25,000 or so higher than July, but it's only 6,000 higher than December and January. So, by and large, it's not far from the average of 50,000, about what we figured we'd have to induct this year.
Well, do you see about 53,000 a month being inducted for the rest of the year?
At least that many, and if it changed, I would think it would go higher rather than lower.
Do you expect that it will go up to the 80,000 a month level of the
No, I don't. I think 60,000 would be high.
What is the reason for this need for the increased need for draftees?
Well, when we started out after Korea, our first job, of course, was to build and also maintain, but maintenance is a very small factor at first, but now maintenance is the whole factor. Because with a 2-year term, men are going out very rapidly because they went in very rapidly 2 years ago.
How many men do you figure you will lose over the coming year from the...
Well, I've heard different estimates, and nobody can guess because there's many factors involved, but I'd say 1,100,000.
Well, is this increased, this stepping up of the number of inductees coming in, is that going to affect people who have hitherto been deferred?
Oh, yes, inevitably, because one of the reasons that people have been deferred, of course there's more than one reason, but one reason has been that we haven't been able to take only about so many, and of course you defer some people, so you won't have to have too many in 1A. And our potential has fallen from about 3,600,000 to about 1,200,000. And hence, by the very mathematics of it, we're going to have to search in the deferred classifications for additional men.
Well, I see, sir. Now, let me ask you this. If I were sitting out here and watching this program on television, and I were deferred in the draft, I would ask a very important question. And I don't know whether you can answer this or not, but can you tell us which of those now deferred are most likely to be brought in?
No, I don't believe I can. This is true, however, that in the first place, if I were over 26 and became over 26 before June 1951, I wouldn't worry, because the law makes me not liable. If I were a veteran, I shouldn't worry. Now, if I am, however, a deferred man, or one who has been rejected in 4F, or one who is in 1A, I would worry in about the inverse order in which I've named them.
Well, in other words, General, we mentioned earlier that there were a considerable number of men who have been deferred. Now, they are liable up to age 35, is that correct?
Yes, anyone that's deferred before he gets to be 26 gains 9 years of additional liability.
That is regardless of their deferment, the reason for their deferment.
That's right.
General, there might be one solution to this problem. I can't advocate it, but you did. And the Universal Military Training Program, I think you appeared before Congress and wanted that program last year. Is that correct?
Well, yes, last year and several years before. I've been for it since about 1908. One of the things complicates it now is that we have other things to do, and it isn't quite as easy to institute, although it is possible to institute it.
Are you still for it?
Absolutely.
Now, what is your interpretation of a universal military program? You've got one now, in effect. I mean,
That's
you're
right.
drafting
We
people.
have it now, and it's just a question of, in another year or two, practically everybody will have been inducted, and therefore we will have had universal training. Unfortunately, at the present time, we're only inducting for a couple of years' service, and when the man comes back and goes into the reserve, he doesn't obviously want to be remobilized. Whereas if he had a shorter term of training, he could be held to a longer period of, well, like the fireman being in the firehouse ready to go.
Well, I know there are quite a lot of people, particularly mothers, who are very much opposed to universal military training. And as a matter of fact, in his Baltimore speech, President Eisenhower said that he wasn't in favor of it. But I wonder if you would like to give the arguments for it as you see them.
Well, I don't remember. I didn't hear the Baltimore speech, but as I remembered, the question was whether or not you could have selective service and universal military training simultaneously.
Oh, I see.
I'm not so sure that President Eisenhower said he wasn't for UMT. I think it was a question of time rather than effort. Now, I've been for universal training because I think that we in wartime or in emergency always require our young men to serve. And I've always thought it was only fair that they have a chance to be ready to do the things the government required of them. And one of the things about it, if you have something that's a little harder than other things, I think it's in a democratic state, it's better to pass it around and not try by mercenary means to hire somebody to do the unpleasant things.
Well, do you see any chance at all of the Congress passing a universal military training program this year?
Well, I think there's always a chance. I don't know how good it is, and I think there's two ways to institute it. One is to institute by additional legislation. The other is to use the legislation which you already have.
Well, your present authority to draft expires in 1955.
That is the liability extends, but the right to call anybody expires in 55. I don't want to be too technical about it, but that is true.
Well, then any kind of a universal military training act would have to take effect after that date.
No, that I don't have. That there's difference of opinion there, but I happen to believe that we could start now to putting some of our people into a reserve with a 7.5 year liability after 6 months of training.
I see. Well, going back for a minute to the deferment question, how about occupational deferment? Do you see any decrease in deferring men for work, apprentice work, farm work, or anything of that order?
Well, I think inevitably, if we're going to follow out the legislation, the Congress passed a universal, I want to repeat, universal military training and service act. Now, the Congress did not defer anyone except the ministers and divinity students, and they exempted those. I think the Congress gave the President power to defer with the idea that they could have a fluid, a flexible method by which each in their turn might serve without too much disturbing the public interest. And I'm not so sure that anyone is going to be deferred throughout their entire period of liability.
Now, General, of course, it's logical. I want to ask a question about this deferment, too. It's logical that an engineer will be deferred before, say, an art student, a student of engineering. Now, would a poor or a bad student of engineering be more likely to be deferred than a very good student of art?
Well, I think you're being a little unfair to the engineer because in the first place I was a liberal arts student and not an engineer. I don't happen to be a specialist, and therefore I probably have a little feeling of frustration.
You mean my question is prejudice so far as
well, no, I'm prejudiced, and I think that we need, one thing we need now are a lot of people to know how to govern ourselves, because I think there's a greater need for that than there is things in the physical sciences, but I'm not joined in that belief by the majority of people.
Now, this word prejudice, here's another subject, General. It has happened, it's human nature, I suppose, but I've heard it more than once, complaints from parents and from boys who did not want to go into the service right now, and they said that the members of their draft board were prejudiced, and that just because this fellow parted his hair that way, they didn't take him, and because their son's hair was parted the other way, they took him. Now, what about this prejudice on draft boards? I haven't heard anything about corruption, but what about prejudice?
Well, of course, in the first place, the board is administering a law. The board didn't place the liability on the lad. The Congress did. The Congress said he'd serve. They did say that the president might issue some orders about when he would serve. And the fellow who serves on the Selective Service Board has the rather hard responsibility of carrying out a law which did not defer people. And I think, after all, that we probably have prejudice. But on the other hand, I think that the local draft boards through the last 13 years have done one of the most remarkable services in trying to do without pay and without anything except the knowledge of having well done a very difficult service, namely to keep the armed forces during the war to 12 million or so, and now to 3,600,000.
Well, quite frankly, have you seen any evidence at all of corruption among these boards? I mean, a board member accepting money to defer somewhat.
No, we've had, I think, a half a dozen or more people tried in 13 years.
I see. Well, now, sir, about this corruption business, about this favoritism business, each board doesn't operate according to the same set of rules, does it?
Oh, well, that's a set of argument, a question of what is rules, what's policy, and what's implementation of policy. I never have believed in uniformity, because there isn't any such thing as uniformity among human beings, but as far as having the same general policy and following the same philosophy, I don't think there's any question. There are a few exceptions, and then when there are exceptions, we have the right of appeal very freely given.
Well, General,
no one has to take the local draft board. You can appeal to the appeal board without a reason.
I see.
And that gives you 2 shots.
Just one final question, and very quickly, General. We hear a lot about the disadvantages of being drafted and why people hate to be drafted. How about some of the good things about being drafted?
Well, I think that a man participates in the most significant thing of his time. I think he goes out feeling he did his share and he didn't try to push somebody else in his way. And if you want to get into material things, he's got practically 3 years of education coming to him on Uncle Sam.
I see, sir. Well, our time is up now. We want to thank you very much, General Hershey, for being with us.
The opinions that you've heard our speakers express tonight have been entirely their own. The editorial board for this edition of the Longines Chronoscope was Mr. Hardy Burt and Mr. William H. Kearns, Jr. Our distinguished guest was the Honorable General Lewis B. Hershey, Director of Selective Service.